The word strategic Bitcoin reserve to the casual observer they sound like a stockpile of an asset. To a closer observer, it sounds like a stockpile of the most valuable asset the human race has ever invented. But I'm here today to show you how the strategic Bitcoin reserve represents a strategy for United States digital supremacy in the 21st century. The president, with his vision, has established a strategic Bitcoin reserve as of last week and has declared that America will be the Bitcoin superpower. That is prescient. I would hazard to guess that the great majority of the people that saw that post don't even know what Bitcoin superpower means, and they haven't really considered it. I was inspired by the words, and that caused me to put together this presentation today. Why is Bitcoin critical to the prosperity of the United States in the 21st century? That is the question we all should be asking. There are many metaphors for thinking about a strategic reserve of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is digital capital. If we thought of it as Bitcoin as digital capital, is this a stockpile of cheese? Is this a stockpile of oil, natural gas, or even uranium, all of which would be interesting? Well, at its worst case, in its narrowest form, you could think about the strategic Bitcoin reserve as a stockpile of the apex asset of the human race. And so what's it worth? Well, over the next 20 years, I think it's worth anywhere from $3 trillion to $106 trillion to the United States. U.S. corporations, like my corporation, are actually recapitalizing on Bitcoin. We've gone from having $250 million of assets 48 months ago to having nearly $45 billion of assets in 48 months. If you look out over the next 20 years, corporations that are accumulating Bitcoin on their reserve, like MSTR, like Mara, like Riot, they're going to have $20 to $40 trillion. So this is a small metaphor, but it's a powerful metaphor. But, you know, it's hard to rent out or finance or develop your cheese or your gold or your natural gas buried in a vault. So a more powerful metaphor is Bitcoin as digital property. If you own 5% of Manhattan and your family had owned it for 100 years and someone said, how are you going to pay your bills? You wouldn't say, we're just going to sell it. You would say, we're going to rent it. We're going to develop it. We're going to put a building on top of it, a business on top of it, or we're going to finance it. We're going to borrow against it. The same is true with Bitcoin. In 20 years, the United States could be generating $10 trillion per year by renting, developing, or financing the assets in that strategic Bitcoin reserve. The AIs are coming. The AIs don't get bank accounts. They don't get credit cards. The AIs, the artificial intelligence economy, will be built on digital capital, digital property. It'll be a $100 trillion economy. It'll be built on Bitcoin. Well, a lot of people, they think of it as an asset. You think of it as a property, but what we know to be true is that Bitcoin is actually a network, and it's not just any network. It's not an information network. It's an energy network. It's a conservative network. I can send $1 billion from me to you. I lose it. You have it. That is the conservation of energy in cyberspace. So when you start to visualize Bitcoin as a digital energy network, what you realize is that trillions of dollars of digital commerce will flow over that network. The banking system of the world is going to rebuild itself on a digital energy network. We're going to have 40,000 banks that will be settling with each other in real time, finally, moving billions, tens of billions, or hundreds of billions of dollars an hour over a pure digital network. Right? So if you look at the world and imagine digital energy moving around the world, and then you ask the question, would you want to own it? Or would you want to ignore it? It's an important question. And of course, you know, I think some of you might have seen the cyber blackout of X yesterday and all the cyber attacks. The last and most important metaphor is When we have open digital energy flowing, it is a commerce network. But when we reverse that digital energy into a shield, it becomes a defense system. Bitcoin's a digital defense system. Bitcoin messages, data authentications, transactions, they're unstoppable, uncorruptible, immutable, immune to tampering by any known cyber threat. You can protect the United States commercial and military and financial systems behind a wall of digital energy. And that's exactly how we will do it. Even Elon Musk pointed out, the AIs don't know how to hack Bitcoin. They can spoof you out of your money. They can convince you that there's someone they're not. There's no way to trick an 800 exahash digital wall that's based on modern encryption. The AIs won't get through that wall. What's driving the growth of Bitcoin? It is the most powerful force in the world right now. It's growing nearly 60%. It's become the eighth largest asset in the world. It's about to become the largest asset in the world in the next 48 months. What is it? It's all of the smart money in the world running from risk, running from the past toward the future, from something less secure to something more secure. And they're doing it in the most visible way with their capital. This is a map of the wealth distribution in the world, about $900 trillion. If you break it into uses, half of it is just a store of value. We're long-term, we're preserving our capital for the long term. We just want to keep our money. The other half are assets held for utility. I want to do something with the asset. If you drill into the 450 trillion, you realize the problem is that long-term capital is being dissipated and decimated by fires, by floods, by famines, by tariffs, by wars, by competition, by rust, by obsolescence, by torts, by traffic, you name it, right? What's that cost? That costs $10 trillion a year. There's people go, well, what is Bitcoin's use case? The use case is to not suffer $10 trillion a year of damage from entropy, from inflation, from chaos, from the future. Bitcoin's an asset without the financial risk of a currency, a bond, a stock, and it doesn't have the physical risk of real estate and property. And we're stripping away the counterparty risk to everything. And so we're moving away from risk, and what that means is that as the word spreads that there's an opportunity to keep your money without taking risk, long-term capital is being merged into the Bitcoin network. The greatest digital transformation of the 21st century, it isn't the transformation of music, it isn't the transformation of your photos, your communications, your Facebook friends, or educational videos, although each of those things made a $1 trillion company. The greatest digital transformation is the transformation of capital. So it's the transformation of 450 trillion. What's it worth? It's worth half of everything. It's half of everything. That's the transformation. Digital capital is stronger, faster, and smarter capital. It's everything you don't like about the building stripped away, and you've got an invisible, indestructible, immortal, teleportable building. It's a better building. It's global capital. It's everybody that's living in Asia and Africa and South America would move to the U.S. if they could. They'd move their money to the U.S. if they could. They want the currency of the U.S. They want the property of the U.S. They want the security of the U.S. They want the values of the U.S. But they can't have it. So the second best thing they can have is move their money into the Bitcoin network, which has all of the values, protections, and securities of the U.S. Bitcoin is immortal capital, right? You can keep your money for 1,000 years. A 10 basis point fee works out to a useful lifetime of 1,000 years. All the other long-term capital assets have a life of 10 to 100 years. Find a business you want to invest in that'll be around for 500 years. Find a building that will last for 500 years. Find a bond that will pay off in 500 years. Find a piece of art that'll still be legible in 500 years. And finally, what we all know in this room is that Bitcoin is, and digital capital is ethical capital. It's the only thing in this world you can truly own. If you have possession of the keys, if you have possession of the knowledge of where the keys might be, you own the thing. No one can take the thing away from you. Everything else you have in this world, you own at the pleasure of someone more powerful than you until they decide to take it away from you. Satoshi gave us property rights, sound money, sovereign money. It's a network, but what is it? It's the world's most powerful network. 800 exahash. What's the measure of digital power? It's exahash. 20 gigawatts, all the electricity, all the power that fires up the U.S. Navy. It's also got the most economic power. My company spent $33 billion to buy 2.4% of the network. Do the math in your head, you'll realize there's $1 trillion of real money that has flowed into this network, and there's $1 trillion of smart money behind it. It's the world's most global, fault-tolerant, unstoppable network. Each of those ASIC chips is hundreds of thousands of laptop computers. You'd need trillions and trillions of computers to dent this network. And then, of course, many people say, oh, I get it, it's a network effect. It must be a network. Yeah. Well, it's not a Metcalfean network. That's just enough information about networks to hurt yourself. It's not getting more powerful with the square of the number of nodes. It's getting more powerful based upon the amount of mass, energy, and capital flowing in the network. It's a Newtonian network, like the solar system. When the white dwarf comes past your planet, it's going to suck the atmosphere off your planet. A white dwarf is not the same as an asteroid the same size. They are different. Bitcoin is the brightest thing in the financial universe, right? Heat and light. It's the most interesting. It's growing stronger. It's growing hotter. It's growing denser as it draws the capital of the world into its orbit. What capital? Physical capital. People are selling their buildings. Financial capital. They're going to trade out their low-grade bonds, their currencies in third world and in the second world. Foreign capital. They're going to sell their Siberian real warehouses and their Russian natural gas rights. It's drawing antiquated capital, the capital of the 20th century. It's drawing smart capital. Anybody that thought about it and thought, do I want to be invested in something that's going to decay or be destroyed over time by 100 uncertain risks, or do I want to just keep my money in cyberspace? And then digital capital, right? The AIs, they don't get the bank account. As the economy digitizes, people want to move digital money at the speed of light with a million transactions a second. You're not doing it with a Siberian warehouse. You're not doing it with natural gas or gold. You're not going to do it with any 20th century asset. Where is it headed? Well, there's an open source model. You can download it on GitHub called Bitcoin 24. Plug in your own assumptions. Our assumptions, well, Bitcoin's currently 22 basis points of the global economy. That's $2 trillion. Over 20 years, right now it's been growing about 60% a year. If it decelerates from 60% a year to 20% a year, the average return is going to be 29% a year over the 20 years. That is the base case. That arrives at a price of $13 million a Bitcoin in USD terms, or $280 trillion in the network. Does the world turn upside down? No. What happens? Well, everything pretty much stays the same, except for those that embrace Bitcoin get rich and powerful. Those that don't embrace Bitcoin get weaker and poorer. Otherwise, everything that you see in the world today will still be there in the world in 20 years. Bitcoin is not a threat to the dollar. The dollar is currency. Bitcoin is capital. In the modern world, there are plenty of academic economists. They will just recite ad infinitum. Well, money is a store of value, a medium of exchange, a unit of account. There, I told you. And they just haven't really thought about that past just rote memory. This is why you shouldn't rote memorize stuff in education. Think a little bit harder about what's going on here. If you need money for the next 4 weeks in Argentina, then you're using the peso. If you need money for the next 4 years in Argentina, you're using the dollar. If you need money for the next 40 years in Argentina and you're smart, you're using the Bitcoin. And so the dollar is competing, but is competing against the M2 money supply of the CNY, Chinese currency, European currency, Japanese currency. Right now we're about 17% of that. We should be able to grow to 30% of that. How? With digital currency. If U.S. banks and U.S. corporations can issue digital currencies backed by the U.S. Treasury, we will expand that supply of U.S. currency by $10 trillion. Right? That's a digital asset strategy. That's why the stablecoin bill and the Genius Act matter. It is not capital. Bitcoin is less than 1% of the capital of the world. What does it compete with? Not the dollar. Bitcoin competes with property, equity, and bonds. Property, equity, and bonds. And what is it? It's 1%. And what is it going to? I just showed you the shocker $13 million Bitcoin forecast. That gets us to 13% of the capital in 2045. We have two strategies. Expand our currency to dominate the world with the digital currency of choice. Expand our capital to dominate the world with the digital capital of choice. Why should the U.S. want to be the Bitcoin superpower? You cannot remain a sovereign nation if you lose control of your airspace, outer space, or cyberspace. This is a truism. It's pretty important. We're not talking about making a little bit of money here. We're talking about defending the American way of life. A superpower has to keep the air routes open. You must be able to fly, not just fly from here to London. You need to be able to fly from New York to Chicago. If you look at what happened in the first Gulf War, we took control of Iraqi airspace. Within a week, their entire country was non-functioning. Some people would say within 48 hours they were non-functioning. This country won't function for 48 hours after we lose control of our airspace. How do we protect it? We have Air Force bases. We have military aircraft. This is evolving. It will continue to evolve. Drones, very sophisticated defense systems. We have to keep open our sea lanes. This is a truism for 1,000 years. The Carthaginians knew it. That's why the Romans destroyed them. The Carthaginians had destroyed the Venetian fleet. Every single port in the Mediterranean that was a Venetian port was also a Roman port, was also a Carthaginian port, was also a Phoenician port. Why? Because you must keep the sea lanes open if you would be a superpower. If I cut off your sea lanes, I choke your economy. The Japanese determined this or found this out in World War II. Sea power requires naval bases operating appropriate ships. A superpower has to keep its cyber channels open. What does that mean? It means your communication channels for digital information, but it also means your communication channels for digital energy. I need to be able to move a signal, but I need to move a $10 billion chunk of money. I don't just need to keep the cyber channels open around the world. It's not just I want to move that information or that energy between New York and Tokyo. If I lose control of cyberspace over the United States, I can't move information between New York and Chicago. Right? You lose cyberspace, you'll lose your own digital economy. What would you do if your enemy got control of your cyberspace? You saw just, again, yesterday, you can't even log into X. Well, what happens when you can't log into your bank account? Cyber power requires Bitcoin miners operating ASICs, throwing up a wall of digital energy. And you want to hope that more than 50% of that is controlled by you or your allies. What does it mean to own cyberspace? If you want to be a Bitcoin superpower, you need to own the asset, own Bitcoin, but that's only half of it. Owning all of New York City and losing control of the sea lanes and the airspace above New York City is a Pyrrhic victory, right? You won't own it very long. It'll get shredded. You have to control the network, the cyber network, the digital energy network that flows around the world. AI is the future. The computers, the AIs, they're smarter than us. They're going to think faster than us. At some point, they'll be thinking 1,000,000 times a second, talking to each other. right? And if you want to build the greatest economy in the world, your cars need to drive themselves, the robots need to think, the factories need to think, and your agent needs to be thinking 1,000,000 times a second about how to do something useful for you. Digital intelligence requires digital energy, which has to be secured by digital power in order to engage in digital commerce. When I say digital commerce, I don't just mean buying trinkets on Amazon. I mean moving all of the money and securing all the assets of the world. I mean 950 trillion going to 4,000 trillion dollars of assets. And it couldn't be clearer where that's headed right now. The unit of digital energy is the Satoshi. The unit of digital power is the exahash, right? What are the benefits to America of the Bitcoin strategy? Embrace Bitcoin, we own the 21st century. All the money, all the capital of the world is moving out of the 20th century. Everything that made sense, every educated financier was educated in the 20th century. They were taught a bunch of bromides, a bunch of rules. All of those rules probably made sense in the 20th century. The way we fought World War II is not the way we fight World War III. Every military doctrine, every financial doctrine, it might have been right at one point. It's not right any longer. Trillions of dollars of capital is going to flow from those physical and financial assets into digital, into the Bitcoin network. Okay, you might say, well, I'm making a strong assertion. Bitcoin is the digital capital network. I'm not just the one making that assertion. The President of the United States made that assertion last week. Explained by David Sachs on Friday night. He said, Bitcoin is the only crypto asset that is truly decentralized. It is special. Maybe in the future there might be some other digital capital. The US government doesn't recognize any other digital capital, nor do we. And that's because 99% of the power in the crypto ecosystem is in the Bitcoin network. If you want to own cyberspace and own the future, you need to own it. Embrace Bitcoin and strengthen the dollar. We have the chance to establish, own, and control the global digital capital network. That is Bitcoin. We can back the US dollar with Bitcoin reserves, the only monetary asset that is competitive to the dollar. If I need a liquid, fungible asset to capitalize a company or an institution, it's not real estate, it's not natural gas, it's not art, it's not private and public equity portfolios, it's not even going to be an index of equity. The only asset that I can use other than Bitcoin is US Treasuries everywhere in the world. If anybody ever decides to replace those, they'll replace them with Bitcoin. We should own both. Embrace Bitcoin, attract foreign capital. It's not just we're getting the 20th century money, we're getting the rest of the world's money. If I gave you money, if I took all your money, I dropped you in Africa and I said, you got to invest in a diversified portfolio of private and public equity and real estate art in Africa, or you can put your money into the digital capital network and move it anywhere else at the speed of light, and I gave you a choice to punch the orange button or leave it in Africa for 100 years, you would punch the orange button. Everybody else in the world's figuring out the same thing right now. That's why countries will make laws against it. That's why the Chinese have export controls on their capital. All of the capital will flow into the U.S. But if you can't physically come to the U.S., the next best thing is you flow into the digital capital network and you get all the protections of the U.S. And finally, you embrace Bitcoin, you empower Americans. It's American companies with Bitcoin on the balance sheet. They're going to outlast, outperform, and outlive their competitors. So American institutions that are holding Bitcoin, they're going to enrich their shareholders. The beneficiaries are us. And the last point, with the appropriate digital assets framework, we can become the bankers to the world, right? When we export Bitcoin to the world, we're exporting our values: sovereignty, sound money, integrity, property rights. When we export digital currency, we're literally exporting our currency. if we create other digital securities or digital tokens, we'll be exporting our companies, our ideas, our securities, our financial products to the world. We can dominate this industry. So how should the U.S. pursue a Bitcoin strategy? Well, Senator Lummis has given us a clear guideline with the Bitcoin Act in Nashville in July. And what the Bitcoin Act said, it said, let's acquire 1 million Bitcoin over a 5-year period in a programmatic, disciplined fashion, transparent to all. And so let's consider the consequences of this strategy. Well, first of all, last week, the President signed the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve Act or order. If we hold that 200,000 Bitcoin for the next 20 years, even though you see a flat line on the screen, the flat line is worth $3 trillion. So that's the value of doing nothing. Sometimes people think that you have to do something to make money. Sometimes the absence of doing awful and stupid things is making money. Doing stuff is highly overrated if the stuff is trading or selling your Bitcoin. The Lummis bill would acquire 1 million Bitcoin or 1.2 million Bitcoin. If you look at the consequences of that over the time frame, it's worth $16 trillion to the nation. If you get a bit more aggressive, and we go for another million, it's worth $34 trillion to the nation. In this case, there's a bit of reflexivity. If the United States starts to more aggressively stockpile Bitcoin, it's going to accelerate the growth of the network. It's going to accelerate capital flowing in the network. It's going to increase and expand the overall digital capital network. If we move to a triple max strategy, you'll end up with 4 million Bitcoin. That's worth $73 trillion to America. And of course, President Trump has laid out a guideline. We should be the superpower. If you want a superpower strategy, here's a superpower strategy. Acquire Bitcoin consistently. By the way, over what time frame? Consistently daily between now and the 0.99. 0.99 is January of the year 2035, the point at which 99% of the Bitcoin supply has been mined. The asset becomes effectively capped for all practical purposes because the last 1% comes out over 100 years. 0.99 between now and then, you've got 10 years for the digital gold rush. You should get your Bitcoin before there's no more Bitcoin for you. And you can see here, in this strategy, we acquire it consistently, and then we use surpluses from the U.S. government to continue to save in Bitcoin. It's worth $106 trillion to the United States. And so what does that look like? Well, the Lummis plan, which is grand, is modest in some ways, and a modest strategic Bitcoin reserve plan neutralizes the national debt. Sometimes doing modest things are actually brilliant as long as you do the thing. It's like the people that bought just a little bit of Bitcoin in 2012. It was a modest investment. It made them billionaires. A modest thing 20 years in advance is a brilliant thing. If you're more aggressive, the triple max plan negates the national debt. The superpower plan creates a global superpower. We bought 78% of the United States for $40 million. $40 million purchased nearly 80% of this country. Think about it for a second. Bitcoin is the greatest opportunity of the 21st century, right? It's worth anywhere from $3 trillion to $106 trillion, depending upon how programmatic and aggressive we want to pursue this opportunity. These opportunities don't come along often. This is the once-in-a-century opportunity. And as Donald Trump has said, never sell your Bitcoin. And I'll leave you with the final thought. What happens if we allow another nation to claim title to Bitcoin superpower? If we don't claim it, We give them control of the network. We give them all the wealth in the world. We risk being impoverished and imperiled by a hostile nation that controls all the world's digital energy. You could have clung to your glass beads when the world went to the gold standard. You could have clung to your steam engines when the world went to internal combustion. You know, you could have kept your wood-burning stoves when Rockefeller offered you petroleum. We could have dismissed nuclear power. We once had another project. We had a Manhattan Project. It was a large investment in nuclear energy. Do you want to control the world's digital energy? Because the digital economy will run on digital energy. The choices are either prosperity or poverty in the 21st century. Bitcoin is manifest destiny for America. Thank you.